that would connect the Caspian to the Persian Gulf, allow for goods and services to move that way. But again, this idea of indispensability, keystone states. You need the keystone in order for the economic apparatus to work. So the Russians are definitely playing in this field as well. Right, so when you start to see these various different proposals of transport corridors and the like, Russia saying Moscow, St. Petersburg become these nodes. Stuff coming from the east, stuff coming from the west, stuff coming from the north and south, transiting Russian territory. So you want a strong Russia, a Russia that's integrated, and obviously a Russia that, one of Russia's selling points is that unlike this route with pirates, unlike pirates here, unlike instability here, this is a safe and secure route for you to transit your goods from marketplace to marketplace. And again, some other ways of looking forward. And the Russians are working with the Chinese on this. Can we create these? And the strategic part, which therefore goes back to a geopolitical side as well, a strategic partnership between Russia and China. Not an alliance, but a strategic partnership, securing each other's backyards, as it were, making these interconnections, making the pitch particularly to South Korea, right? Because if South Korea sort of sees itself right now as a bit of an island, that wouldn't you like to be linked into this? So what happens with the new president of South Korea, we'll have to see. The previous president, President Park, was very big on what she referred to as the Busan Initiative, that the port of Busan here at the tip of the Korean peninsula would become one of these nodes for a transit network that would stretch all the way to Europe. We'll see if the new president of South Korea shares that vision or not. The Japanese, this idea of energy partnerships and manufacturing and resource partnerships, but also the same thing, connecting between Japan and the Russian Far East, and then connecting across into your European markets. I'd also like to take a minute and come back to where geopolitics and geoeconomics begin to come together in terms of seeing Russia's strategic moves in the last year and its economic moves, and how these things begin to tie together. So, Russian state oil company, Rosneft, has some new drilling deals in northern Iraq. How do we get Kurdish energy to market? What happens with Syria? What happens with Turkey? Is there a way to get the pipelines and other things reopened? Do you get energy from there to Ceyhan, the Turkish port there? Russian involvement in southern Iraq. And usually when Russia talks oil with Iraq, there's also people talking about weapons purchases and security assistance. So what will Iraq be buying from Russia? President Rouhani is going to Moscow, should be there a couple days. One of the talks is about the 100,000 barrel a day oil swap with Iran, 100,000 barrels a day made available to Russian companies in return for goods and services provided by Russia. That oil is intended to go here, India, where coincidentally Rosneft has just purchased SR Oil, or a controlling stake in that, so a very large refinery operation in India, which they can supply from crude that is produced in Iran, send it to India, refine it there, sell it to the Indian market, sell it to other parts of Southeast Asia. Russian development of oil and gas in Vietnam. Fortunately, this map won't allow me, if I had a larger world map. Russia's been a key player in the Venezuelan oil and gas sector. Also a big provider of military assistance to the current government in Venezuela, which they would like to see stay intact and in power and not removed. Venezuelan state oil company, strapped for cash, having problems investing in capacity to keep production up and going and developing new fields. It's been turning to Russia and China. Russian state oil company has been investing. Last year, the Venezuelans borrowed billions from the Russians. They put their share in Citgo as collateral. Citgo is not likely, our Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. is probably not going to bless Rosneft acquiring controlling stake in Citgo as an American refinery and provider, which means that, and we're already starting to see it, which is that the Venezuelans are now saying, well, maybe we're going to have to offer Russia more equity in more projects in Venezuela. So more oil fields, more gas fields. As those projects move forward, what it means is that Russia controls that production because it's assigned to them in lieu of debt repayment. Because PDVSA, the state oil company of Venezuela, doesn't have ready cash, so they pay debt service in oil. That oil also expected, fortunately, as I said, I should have brought a larger global map. From Venezuela's Pacific ports is meant for India, again for the SR refineries that Rosneft controls in India, and then that helps increase Rosneft's share of oil markets in Southeast Asia. Russia currently is still under sanction, so that American and European companies cannot do technology transfer of their most advanced techniques to projects in Russia. Despite some early flurries that the administration was going to lift sanctions on Russia, there's no indication that there's any sanctions relief coming for Russia on this matter anytime soon. The Europeans, there's always a number of European countries that don't want to renew the sanctions on Russia. They have to be renewed every 6 months, and yet they get renewed every 6 months. So the Russians have become a bit craftier with that, and there's nothing in the sanctions that says that a Russian company can't partner with, say, an American company to do a project in a third country. So Schlumberger, Franco-American oil services provider, by sanctions law cannot cooperate with the Russian state oil company on projects in Russia. They can, however, cooperate and are going to cooperate on some new projects in Brazil. If those projects generate enough oil, they'll feed in with the Venezuelan production and be shipped to the Indian market. But the most important thing is that Rosneft and Schlumberger will be working together. Rosneft engineers and Rosneft has its own oil services company, can observe the techniques and see how Schlumberger operates, and then there's nothing about repatriation of experience back to Russia, and so this may be a way to get around the formal sanctions of, well, we can't do a project with you in Russia, but we can do it somewhere else, and then from that, the Russians can bring that project back. Finally, the most interesting one in the last 6 months or so, Eni, the Italian company, sold its interest in offshore gas fields in Egypt to Rosneft, so the Russians are now going to be a bigger player in the Egyptian gas markets. Russia has new security cooperation with Egypt, particularly to fortify Egypt's western boundaries against instability from Libya, and Russia is a big sponsor and partner with General Haftar in Libya, happens to control this part of Libya, and Rosneft is going to have new contracts for developing and processing oil in this part of Libya, is the plan. which would then be shipped to southern European markets so that Rosneft can meet its obligations there. So there's a bit of tying together, where does Russia intervene militarily, where does it put troops on the ground, where does it sell weapons to, and then where do Russian companies go, and what is it they expect to do, and how do they expect to play in markets. All of this, by the way, is working against the backdrop of an agreement that is still holding with OPEC to keep production frozen. The other thing was Saudi Arabia thought it could drive the price down and hurt Russia. Turned out it hurt Saudi Arabia more than it hurt Russia. They agreed to oil production freeze. Russia's clients are growing, and so again, for Rosneft, as the state oil company, they can adhere to the letter of the production agreement, but with all of these new developments, they can be servicing their clients by using Iranian oil, Venezuelan oil, potentially Kurdish oil, potentially Libyan oil, and therefore keep their market share as one of the world's main players in that field. All right. So let me just end on this. One of the things I'm critical of in Washington when I go down to brief people is we're very binary. Either the Russians are about to fall or they're 10 feet tall. Either the Russians are going to collapse in 2 years, or there's nothing stopping them, and Russian tanks will be in Berlin and Paris in 3 days. This approach, which unfortunately is fostered also in the media and among some people on the Hill, is dangerous for good analysis, because it means we can't see the picture as it actually is. We either have to We want to justify a narrative of Russia collapse, or we want to justify a narrative of the Russian, it's back, it's 1985 all over again. I look at these strategies and these proposals a lot like I looked at the Russian defense procurement strategy that started in 2011 and 2012. When that strategy came out, some people said, wow, if the Russians succeed in this, you know, it will really make them a formidable force, and then others said they're not going to be able to do it. They achieved about 60% of their objectives so far. It's probably what they're going, this strategy, they're probably going to achieve about 60% of what they hope to achieve with it, which doesn't make them 10 feet tall, but it doesn't make them on the verge of collapse either. With these, some of these geoeconomic, geopolitical strategies, some of these things aren't going to work. Some of them are going to pan out. Not everything is going to succeed. Some of it will. And because some of it will succeed, it means Russia will continue to be a player that we have to take seriously, that we have to evaluate. We can't wish it away. We shouldn't over-dramatize it, but it's there. It's a reality. And the sooner that we get that check in place on our thinking about Russia, the more effective we'll be able to develop policies to decide what we want to do in response. All right, so I'll stop there and start getting questions.
Good.